during Joe Biden's term, there were waves of sanctions levied against China to disrupt the use and production of sophisticated semiconductor technologies. China has responded by banning exports of key materials to the US. Can you unpack what the consequences have been of this US-led trade war? Well, trade.
Sure. Yes. So I would say that just to zoom out a little bit, that semiconductors have become the primary battleground for the trade war waged by the US and its allies on China for a number of reasons. One is simply the size and centrality of the semiconductor industry. We're at over $600 billion in sales annually of semiconductors, and they really are crucial to every facet of the modern economy. In terms of what is like driving a disproportionate amount of that investment beyond the fact that, the semiconducting chips are in virtually all electronics, a lot of the capital rushing in, particularly for high-end chips, is the hype around artificial intelligence. And when it comes to the supply chain for semiconductors, it's true that though China has been closing the gap, there are still relatively few parts of the global supply chain in which mainland China actually is an industry leader. The main sectors where it is sort of a dominant player would be in the supply of raw materials and also in the chip assembly process. But the rest of the supply chain and all these so-called chokeholds are still firmly captured by the US and its geopolitical vassals. So the US itself, even after it largely offshored the actual manufacturing process, it still has a near monopoly on chip design and on fabrication equipment. As I alluded to in my last answer, Taiwan's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, has an overwhelming global share of high-end chip manufacturing. And, another firm in the Netherlands, ASML, really has a near monopoly on the so-called EUV or extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment that's needed to etch these extremely small parts into, the silicon wafers that form the material substrate for semiconductors. So, those are all actors that the US can strong arm into going along with its program of export controls. And because of the structure of the supply chain, the US does still have substantial leverage to really hold back and attempt to actually retard China's sort of autocentric and sovereign technological development in this particular sector. And it's wielded that with increasingly blunt instruments, increasingly broad export bans on, larger and larger categories of equipment. And, as I mentioned, essentially forcing many of its proxies to do the same, which has, had severe negative economic effects on some of the most loyal of those proxies. For example, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan in the East Asian region. So, with regards to China's response, in terms of retaliatory measures, at least, it was in reaction to Biden's last wave of export controls when he was a lame duck last December, when China announced retaliatory bans on exports of gallium and germanium to the US. Both are essential raw materials for the manufacture of semiconducting chips, and China produces 99% and 59% of the global supply, respectively, of refined gallium and of germanium. So that's one of the parts of the supply chain where it does actually possess tremendous leverage. And I thought what was also interesting about this maneuver is that the US has always put forward specious justifications for its export controls in semiconductors, where they claim that, these are dual use and that China will employ its homegrown semiconductor industry to both military and civilian ends. So China, in sort of justifying its retaliation, kind of mirrored this and was invoking the military civilian dual use potential of these materials, which undoubtedly is true for these exports to the US. We all know how grotesquely oversized the US arms industry is. Now, I will say that these retaliatory export controls from China, they won't necessarily have a devastating immediate impact on the supply of semiconducting chips in the US. And that's precisely because it has outsourced most chip fabrication. In fact, it did so decades ago. And thus far, its efforts to supposedly reshore it have largely failed, even after strong arming, for example, TSMC into building their newest facility in Arizona. As for the domestic response over the last several years, China has essentially treated the increasingly vice-like grip of these US trade restrictions as a spur to domestic innovation, with very obvious payoffs. So, one that happened a few years ago was much faster than anyone expected. China's own semiconductor foundry, SMIC, was able to indigenously manufacture so-called 7 nanometer chips, which were then immediately commercially deployed in the Huawei Mate 60 smartphone. And then the even greater fanfare, of course, earlier this year, speaking of the AI hype that I brought up earlier, we had the comparatively very small Chinese firm DeepSeek, which deployed an open source AI model that was very competitive with leading US giants and trained for about a 50th of the cost on a relatively small number of basically stockpiled NVIDIA GPUs. And their ability to do this so economically, so efficiently, to such great effect, and in open source fashion, as we all remember, triggered the largest single day loss in US stock market history.
So another component of the US's trade war against China that has been making the headlines are, of course, the tariffs on China imports. Could you unpack the repercussions of what has actually been put into effect and the response of China as well to this?
Yeah, I guess I would start off again with a more general comment about Trump's almost neo-mercantilist obsession with tariffs, which is that even though some left economists like Yanis Varoufakis have tried to make sense of it, I think it does reflect a deeply unsound grasp of the US trade deficit and of its underlying causes, because Trump really sees it as a source of weakness. He sees it as a main cause of US deindustrialization, the hollowing out of its manufacturing base, when in fact what it has done historically and continues to do is the trade deficit kind of underwrites the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, which is, of course, a major cornerstone of the country's imperial hegemony. Because it imports so much more than it exports, because it pays for that in dollars, it basically forcibly pumps dollars into the global economy, cycles them, drives up demand for dollars. And this seems in many ways lost on Trump, but he nonetheless is set on tariffs as a vehicle somehow of their own accord for reviving domestic manufacturing. And what's been interesting in his opening tariff threats, specifically against Canada, Mexico, and China, is that he's tied this in with another obsession of his, namely on the spurious ties between immigration and the fentanyl supply to the United States, right? A very biopolitical language focused on the supposed weakening of the US body politic. And the way that he ties this all together somewhat nebulously is that he positions the US's two neighbors on the continent, Canada and Mexico, as supposed conduits for what the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, describes in incredibly racist terms as, quote unquote, reverse opium war that China supposedly is waging against the West through production of fentanyl precursors and so on and so forth. And of course, this is all completely bogus, but in some ways is the deeply confused mixture of ideological rationales that Trump is operating on with this opening salvo of tariff threats. So, of course, back in early February, that took the form, or it was threatened to take the form of across-the-board tariffs, irrespective of import sector, of 25% for imports from Canada and Mexico, and initially just 10% for China, though this later was ratcheted up to 20% a month later. And, what's sort of interesting is that only for China have tariffs actually gone into effect for all imports across the board, even though the 20% is still a far cry from the 60% that Trump mooted on the campaign trail, which would have truly catastrophic effects on everyday consumers in the US. As for China's response, I think what most have observed is that it's been, on the whole, more targeted and better planned than it was in Trump's first term, when he really sort of initiated this current phase of the trade war. So, of course, there have been retaliatory tariffs, but they have not been across the board. China has imposed 15% tariffs on coal and liquefied natural gas imports from the US, 10% on crude oil and auto imports. And, what's noticeable about targeting these sectors is that, on the one hand, their production in the US is concentrated in Trump's geographical base, and ideologically as well, the renewed production of US fossil fuels is really core to, Trump's supposed appeal to the industrial working class. But on the other hand, these are all sectors where China has ample alternative supplies, right? Whether from other suppliers in the global south or, in the case of autos, of cars, certainly domestic supply as well. So their actual impact on the Chinese economy will be limited in that way. China also did announce a swath of new export controls as well on additional critical minerals on top of the ones that fell under its December export ban. So these new ones include tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, and indium. And each of these, again, are elements where China produces at least 70% of the global supply. So yeah, in addition, again, very targeted measures were taken against specific corporations like Google for antitrust grounds. But on the whole, what we've seen so far from China is a relatively measured and targeted response, which indicates that China is preparing for likely further escalation, whether heightened targeting of certain sectors or, further ratcheting up of the tariff level. So, it wants to have more room for maneuver to retaliate in turn. And what's also notable about this for me is that unlike Canada, for example, China has made absolutely no preemptive concessions to Trump in an attempt to avert these tariffs, even symbolically. And it's really digging itself in for what is likely is to be a protracted struggle. And some of the diplomatic messaging, for example, these statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, amplified by various embassies, including China's embassy in the US, that China is prepared for a trade war or any other kind of war, really speak to this.